The courtroom of Jefferson County, located in downtown Birmingham, Alabama, held an air of suffocating authority. It wasn't just the humidity from the Alabama summer that made the air thick. It was something heavier, an unspoken power, the kind that lingered in the cracks of the building's oak doors, something that had settled there over the decades of its use. Everyone who entered the Jefferson County Courthouse knew exactly who ruled within its walls. Judge Diane Roberts. Judge Roberts had sat on the bench for 24 years, a position that allowed her to carve out a legacy, though not one found on plaques or textbooks. It was the kind of legacy discussed in whispers, the kind that lingered in the back halls of bar association meetings, often spoken of only in hushed tones. To those in the know, especially black attorneys, Judge Roberts was a name that carried weight, but not the kind you'd hope for in a judge. Her reputation was that of a woman whose decisions were almost always predictable, whose biases were openly clear, and whose courtroom was a space where the rule of law took a back seat to personal power. The attorneys who walked into her courtroom knew the drill. They knew the pattern of how objections would be ruled, how cases would unfold. If you were on her bad side, like so many were, you were already fighting a losing battle before you even began. Today was different, however. Today, one man had decided he wasn't going to let Judge Roberts' unchallenged power continue. That man was Michael Carter, a defense attorney who had made a name for himself as the one who stood up against corruption in the legal system, the one who was willing to take on the tough cases no one else dared. He had built his reputation not by choosing easy battles, but by taking on the ones most others would avoid and winning. Michael had faced down judges, prosecutors, in a system that seemed to protect its own. But standing before Judge Roberts, he felt something different. The weight of years of legal manipulation hung in the air. Michael knew what this was. He wasn't here just to defend his client, Jackson Williams, a man falsely accused of armed robbery. He was here to do something much bigger. He was here to expose the system that had protected people like Judge Roberts for far too long. As Michael walked into the courtroom, his polished shoes clicked against the cold marble floor. His eyes didn't waver as he approached the defense table. The murmur of the courtroom seemed to fade away as his presence filled the space. Jackson Williams sat beside him, shoulders slumped, hands trembling in his lap. The years he had spent in the system had worn him down. This wasn't just about his case. It was about everything that came before it. This was about breaking a system that had been rigged for decades. Judge Roberts, perched on her high chair, looked down at Michael with barely concealed disdain. Her sharp gaze cut through him as she adjusted her glasses, scanning the papers in front of her. Without lifting her eyes, she addressed him. "Mr. Carter," she said coolly, "I trust you understand the decorum of this courtroom. Don't waste my time." Michael felt the weight of her words, but he remained unfazed. This wasn't his first fight in a hostile courtroom. He knew exactly how to play the game. "I'll keep that in mind, Your Honor," he replied, his voice calm but firm. Judge Roberts made no acknowledgement of his response as she turned to the prosecution. A young, eager assistant district attorney named Philip Barnett stood fresh out of law school and ready to prove himself. His eyes gleamed with the kind of ambition that made him blind to the reality of the situation. "The state is ready, Your Honor," Barnett said, casting a brief, smug glance at Michael. Michael didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew the prosecution's case was weak. What he was up against wasn't just the case. It was Roberts' unwavering control over this courtroom and the power that came with it. He had been in enough of these situations to recognize it wasn't just a battle for his client's freedom, it was a battle for the very soul of justice in this courthouse. "We're ready too, Your Honor," Michael said, loud enough for everyone to hear, making sure the jury could feel the shift in the room. For the first time in years, someone was standing up to Judge Roberts. As Michael Carter took his seat, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted ever so slightly. The air, once thick with the tension of the unknown, now hummed with the energy of a battle that was about to unfold. The prosecution was ready, and Judge Roberts, perched high on her bench, was already in her element. She didn't need to raise her voice to command authority. Her cold stare did that for her. Michael could see the way she looked at him, her eyes narrowing as though she could already see the outcome. This wasn't going to be a fair trial. It was going to be a performance. And Judge Roberts had the starring role. Every move she made, every word she spoke, seemed designed to remind everyone in the room just who was in charge. But Michael was prepared. He had been preparing for this moment for years. "Mr. Barnett, you may proceed," Judge Roberts said, her voice low but full of command. Barnett cleared his throat and began his questioning. He fumbled through his notes, clearly trying to impress Judge Roberts with his legal knowledge, but his uncertainty was evident. Michael watched the young prosecutor closely, his eyes flicking from Barnett's nervous movements to the jury's subtle glances. The jury was noticing everything: the tension between the judge and defense attorney, the way Barnett stumbled through his questions, and the way Roberts seemed to dismiss every objection Michael raised. Michael wasn't just defending Jackson Williams. This was bigger than that. Every time Barnett stammered or missed a point, Michael knew it was a chance to take control. The trial wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about Roberts' biases, her unchecked power, and her complete disregard for justice. Michael wasn't going to let her get away with it. Not today. The first witness was called, a store clerk who had allegedly seen Jackson at the scene of the robbery. The witness, an elderly man named Mr. Thomas, took the stand. Michael could tell the man wasn't entirely sure about his identification. It was the kind of hesitation he had seen before, a hesitation that meant doubt. Michael's instincts told him that the case against his client wasn't as strong as the prosecution wanted everyone to believe. Barnett wasted no time, quickly diving into the questioning. "Mr. Thomas, can you confirm that the defendant, Jackson Williams, was the man you saw at the scene of the robbery?" The old man hesitated, his eyes flickering nervously. I think so," he said, his voice wavering. Michael was already on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he said, his voice firm. "That is not a definitive statement. The witness is unsure." Judge Roberts didn't even flinch. "Overruled," she said, barely looking up from her papers. Michael's jaw clenched, but he didn't let his frustration show. He could feel the weight of the moment. This was the first of many battles, and it wasn't going to be easy. He had known from the start that Roberts wouldn't give him an inch, but he had also prepared for this. He was patient, and he was determined. He turned his attention back to Mr. Thomas, his voice steady as he approached the witness stand. "Mr. Thomas, you said you think you saw my client at the scene. How sure are you?" Mr. Thomas licked his lips nervously, shifting in his seat. I thought I saw him, but I'm not certain." Before Michael could follow up, Judge Roberts interrupted. "Move on, Mr. Carter." Michael met her gaze, unblinking. "Your Honor, the witness has the right to clarify his statement," he said, his tone measured but insistent. Roberts' eyes darkened, her lips tightening. "Move on," she repeated, her voice cold. Michael paused, his mind working quickly. This wasn't just about the witness, it was about the message Roberts was sending. She was shutting him down, not because the law supported her, but because she was comfortable in her power. She wasn't concerned with the truth, she was concerned with maintaining control. "For the record, Your Honor," Michael said, his voice calm but resolute, "you are preventing the witness from clarifying his statement. This is a violation of my client's right to a fair trial." Judge Roberts slammed her gavel with a force that echoed through the courtroom. "Enough, Mr. Carter. One more word, and I will have you removed from this courtroom." Michael's gaze remained steady as he sat back down, his expression unreadable. He could feel the eyes of the jury on him. They were watching every move, every word. This was bigger than just this case. It was about something deeper. Michael knew the only way to win this battle was to expose Roberts for what she truly was. A judge who had grown too comfortable in her own power, a judge who had stopped caring about the truth. As the trial continued, the tension in the room grew. Michael knew the jury could feel it. He wasn't just fighting for Jackson's freedom anymore. He was fighting to bring down the corrupt system that had allowed Judge Roberts to rule unchecked for so long. The trial dragged on, but Michael Carter could feel the walls of the courtroom closing in around him. Judge Roberts, as he had expected, wasn't making this easy. Every objection he raised was met with the same dismissive wave of her hand. Every argument he presented was overruled with the kind of speed that suggested she had already made up her mind. It wasn't a trial, it was a performance, and Roberts was playing the lead role. Michael had faced plenty of hostile courtrooms, but this was different. He could sense it in the way Roberts wielded her power, casually, almost carelessly, as if she was untouchable. She didn't even try to hide her contempt for him. Every time he made a valid point, she shot him down with a swift, practiced ease. Every time he raised an objection, she acted like he wasn't even there. His client, Jackson Williams, sat beside him, hands folded in his lap, shoulders slumped. Michael could see the hopelessness in Jackson's eyes. The young man had spent too many years in the system, and he had already begun to believe that no one could save him from the corrupt judge that had already sentenced him in her mind. But Michael wasn't just here to save Jackson. He was here to tear down everything that Judge Roberts had built over the years. The corrupt system that had allowed her to maintain unchecked power for decades. He couldn't afford to lose his focus. Every moment in that courtroom was a calculated move. Every word, every objection, every pause. He was setting the stage for something much bigger than just this trial. "Mr. Carter," Judge Roberts said coldly, her sharp gaze cutting through him like a blade. "I would appreciate it if you stopped turning this into some sort of sideshow. We have a full docket to get through today." Michael didn't flinch. "I'll keep that in mind, Your Honor," he replied, his voice even. His mind was focused. He had been prepared for this kind of treatment. Roberts had a reputation for dismissing anything that didn't fit her narrative, and he knew that if he didn't push back now, she would continue to trample over his client's rights without hesitation. The trial had become a spectacle. Michael knew it, the jury knew it, and the gallery knew it. But no one, not even the jury, was brave enough to say anything. They saw how Roberts manipulated the proceedings, how she played favorites with the prosecution, how she refused to allow Michael to do his job. Yet they were too afraid to speak up, too afraid to challenge the system that had allowed this to go on for so long. At least that was until Michael decided to take it a step further. When the next witness was called, a supposed expert in forensic evidence who had been brought in to strengthen the prosecution's case, Michael knew he had to strike. The witness, Dr. Edward Barnes, took the stand with all the confidence of a seasoned professional, ready to testify about the supposed physical evidence that tied Jackson Williams to the crime. But Michael had done his homework. He wasn't going to let Dr. Barnes slide by with vague testimony. As the expert rattled off his conclusions, Michael's sharp eyes caught a small detail that didn't add up. The forensic report didn't match up with the evidence he had reviewed. "Objection, Your Honor," Michael said, rising from his seat. Judge Roberts didn't even glance up from her papers. "On what grounds?" she asked dismissively. "Dr. Barnes's conclusions are based on faulty evidence, Your Honor," Michael stated, his voice firm. "This is a misrepresentation of the facts." Roberts didn't even pause. "Overruled," she said without missing a beat. Michael clenched his jaw. He knew this was coming. He had expected Roberts to dismiss his objections, but that didn't mean he was going to give up. Not now, not when everything he had worked for was on the line. He approached the witness stand, looking directly at Dr. Barnes. "Dr. Barnes," he said, his voice calm but insistent, "you've testified that the forensic evidence directly links my client to the scene. But upon reviewing the evidence myself, I found inconsistencies. Can you explain why the report you've provided contradicts the findings in the original investigation?" Dr. Barnes hesitated, clearly caught off guard. I'm not sure what you mean. The evidence clearly shows—" "Objection, Your Honor," Michael interrupted, cutting him off before he could ramble on. "The witness is giving an opinion without any factual basis. This is not expert testimony. It's conjecture." Once again, Roberts didn't look up. "Sustained," she said, her tone cold. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes moving from Michael to Roberts and back again. Michael could feel the shift. They saw what was happening. They could feel the tension in the room, how Roberts was shutting down every valid argument, every attempt to expose the truth. "Dr. Barnes," Michael said, taking a step back, "I believe the jury is entitled to hear the full truth, and that includes the flaws in your testimony." At that moment, Roberts slammed her gavel down with force, the sharp sound reverberating off the walls. "That's enough, Mr. Carter," she snapped. "If you continue to waste this court's time, I will have you removed." Michael stood still, his expression unwavering. He knew he was walking a fine line. But this wasn't just about Jackson anymore. It was about making Roberts expose herself for who she truly was. A judge who had allowed her biases to govern her decisions for far too long. And he wasn't done yet. The courtroom grew heavier as the day wore on, the tension rising with every passing minute. Michael Carter could feel the weight of it. Judge Roberts was becoming more and more agitated, and with each of his objections that she dismissed, her contempt for him seemed to grow. Michael was prepared for this fight, but the stakes were rising higher than he had anticipated. He wasn't just defending Jackson Williams anymore. He was fighting a system that had enabled Roberts to remain untouchable for decades. As the trial progressed, Michael carefully steered the proceedings toward a breaking point. He had planned it this way. His strategy had always been to bait Roberts, to push her into making mistakes, to expose her biases and flaws for the jury and everyone in the room to see. He knew that the more she lashed out, the more obvious it would become to those watching that she was no longer in control. And the moment would come when her arrogance would be her downfall. That moment came sooner than he expected. Just as Roberts was preparing to rule on another motion, the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a force that cut through the tension in the room like a knife. The sound alone was enough to make everyone pause and look toward the entrance. Two federal agents, dressed in dark suits and moving with precise, purposeful steps, strode into the room. The courtroom fell silent, every eye fixed on the agents as they moved toward the bench. Michael didn't react. He remained calm, smoothing out his tie and folding his hands neatly on the defense table. He had known this moment was coming, and he had been waiting for it. Roberts, on the other hand, looked momentarily confused, her eyes flicking from the agents to the papers in front of her. She frowned, her brow furrowing as if trying to make sense of the interruption. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp with authority. One of the agents, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward and flashed a badge. "Judge Diane Roberts," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "We need to speak with you immediately." Roberts' jaw tightened, her lips curling into a tight line. "I am in the middle of a trial," she snapped, unwilling to give up control so easily. "This is highly inappropriate. Whatever this is, it will have to wait until I conclude these proceedings." The other agent stepped forward now, addressing the entire courtroom. "This is a matter of federal interest. It cannot wait." A ripple of whispers spread through the gallery as the courtroom filled with an uneasy buzz. Even the jury, sworn to impartiality, couldn't hide their curiosity. Philip Barnett, the young prosecutor who had been so eager to please Roberts, looked awkward, his face pale as he glanced at her, unsure of what to do next. "Should we take a recess, Your Honor?" Barnett stammered, clearly rattled. Roberts, however, wasn't ready to yield. Her fingers curled into the edge of the bench as she steeled herself, unwilling to show any weakness. "We are not taking a recess," she barked. "The defense has wasted enough of this court's time, and I refuse to allow—" The first agent cut her off, his voice firm and unyielding. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The entire courtroom gasped. The sound was like a collective intake of breath, the shock settling into the very bones of the room. For the first time in 24 years, Judge Diane Roberts had lost control of her courtroom. The audience, the jury, and even Michael could feel the weight of the moment, a shift in the air that changed everything. Michael remained seated, his hands still folded on the defense table. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He had won. "Judge Roberts," the lead agent continued, "you are under arrest under suspicion of bribery, abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights under federal law." The courtroom exploded in noise. Some people were stunned into silence. Others whispered in shock, while a few reporters frantically scribbled notes, trying to capture the moment. Michael's eyes didn't leave Roberts as she absorbed the news. Her face drained of color, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes that he had never expected. Fear. For 24 years, Judge Roberts had ruled this courtroom with an iron fist. She had manipulated cases, taken bribes, and delivered rulings that fit her own biases. But now all of that was crumbling. Michael had spent years gathering the evidence to bring her down, and now as the agents moved toward her to make the arrest, he knew this was just the beginning of something much larger. The system that had allowed Roberts to operate with impunity was finally starting to break apart. "Michael?" Jackson Williams whispered, his voice barely audible as he turned to his attorney. "Man, I can't believe this is happening." Michael didn't look at him. His eyes remained locked on the scene unfolding before him. The agents were now standing at the bench, waiting for Roberts to comply. The once imposing judge, the woman who had terrified so many attorneys, was now standing at the center of the storm she had created. "Your Honor," Michael said, his voice cutting through the chaos, "I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial, but it seems this trial is now the least of your concerns." Roberts turned her eyes toward him, her mouth opening as if to argue, but the words never came. The lead agent stepped forward, pulling out a folded sheet of paper and reading aloud. "Meredith Roberts," he began, "you are under arrest for multiple violations of the Civil Rights Act, bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of judicial power. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The courtroom watched in a stunned silence as the agent read her rights. For the first time, Judge Roberts was no longer in control. She had become just another defendant in the system she had spent years exploiting. The room fell into an eerie silence, the kind that hung heavily in the air like a thick fog. For the first time in 24 years, Judge Diane Roberts stood before the very system she had bent and manipulated. The federal agents, their hands steady, moved toward her with the calm authority of those who had come prepared for this moment. As they placed the cuffs around her wrists, the once mighty judge seemed to shrink before the eyes of the courtroom. Michael Carter sat still at the defense table, his gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before him. His chest was tight, not with triumph, but with the realization that this wasn't just about Jackson Williams. It wasn't just about the case that had brought him here. This was about something far bigger, a reckoning that had been years in the making, and it was only the beginning. As the agents escorted Roberts toward the back of the courtroom, her face pale and her eyes frantic, Michael couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The years of painstaking work, the long hours spent gathering evidence, the quiet patience that had led him here. It had all paid off. Judge Roberts, the woman who had once been untouchable, was now just another defendant, standing in the very courtroom she had used to destroy so many lives. The room buzzed with whispers, some shocked, some jubilant, but all of them marked by disbelief. The jury, though bound by their oath of impartiality, couldn't hide their discomfort. Even Philip Barnett, the young prosecutor who had once been so eager to please Roberts, now sat frozen at his desk, his eyes wide, his mouth agape. He had just watched the foundation of his entire legal career crumble before him. "Mr. Carter," the new judge, an older black man with a reputation for fairness, said, addressing Michael after a long silence, "Given these developments, I believe a dismissal of all charges against Mr. Williams is in order." Michael nodded, his face serious. "Your Honor, this entire trial has been compromised from the start. Judge Roberts' arrest today proves what we've known all along. She was never impartial. This case was manipulated from the beginning." The new judge's gaze flickered toward the jury, then back to Michael. He nodded slowly. "I agree. The charges against Mr. Williams are hereby dismissed." The words hung in the air for a moment before the bailiff moved toward Jackson, unshackling him from the seat where he had sat in chains for so long. Jackson exhaled a deep, shaky breath, his hands now free for the first time in years. He rubbed his wrists, looking at Michael with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "I don't even know what to say," Jackson muttered, shaking his head. "You don't have to say anything," Michael replied, standing and placing a hand on his client's shoulder. "You're free, and that's what matters." As Jackson stood and walked toward the door, Michael's mind was already racing. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The battle against corruption in the justice system had just begun. Today, Roberts had fallen, but Michael knew there were more like her out there. More judges, more prosecutors, more officials who believed they could operate without consequence. But Michael had just shown them all that the system could still work, even if it was broken. He had played the long game, and now the tide was beginning to turn. There was still so much work to do. There were still so many lives to be fought for. As the courtroom slowly emptied, Michael stood alone, his eyes lingering on the empty bench where Roberts had once presided. It had been a long fight, and it wasn't over yet. But today, Michael had made sure that justice had, for once, been served.